This is where I probably commit more journalism than any other place. It's my little office in my home in London. I've lived here for nearly 40 years. My name's Robin Lustig. This is The Compass on the BBC World Service, and this is the last episode in my series on the future of free speech. In the old days, I couldn't do that much journalism from here. I would have to go to a newsroom or to a newspaper office or to the BBC. But now, I just sit in front of my computer. The world is my oyster. I spend hours on Facebook, on Twitter, on the internet. These days, whatever I want to say, whatever I want to write, I do it from here. This is where I exercise my right of free speech.
Freedom of speech has never been a luxury.
If I post anything and I refresh my page automatically, at least 5 people will have seen it, and these are probably government censors.
The fact that the air may at times be filled with cacophony is a sign of our strength, not of our weakness.
What I've been trying to do in this series is look at who controls what we can and can't say. The people I call the free speech gatekeepers, the courts which uphold the rule of law, the universities who make difficult decisions about the limits of debate, religious leaders who seek to punish those who contradict their teachings, and journalists who frame public discourse and are themselves subject to competing pressures. In this final episode, I'm going to look at perhaps the most powerful gatekeepers of them all, and the ones who seem least comfortable in that role, the people who run the social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, because today that's where more of us than ever before in our history are exercising our right to free speech. And because now, with the world facing a global health emergency, I want to consider whether what the American law professor Stephen Wormiel calls that cacophony of views and information is a help or a hindrance. Well, to get a handle on that, I've invited the social media analyst Alex Krasodomski of the London-based think tank Demos to join me here in my little office, my digital window on the world.
What are the principles that define these spaces? Well, it's advertising revenue. That's what makes these platforms so successful. The only thing that they are accountable really to is, well, increasingly government, but primarily to sort of Silicon Valley venture capital. This is what is often referred to as an attention economy. These websites, their value is a function of the amount of eyeballs they can grab and hold on their screens for the maximum amount of time. And as a result, advertising revenue increases. Now, that's a bit of a simplification, but I think it is a useful thing. And it does sort of talk to this idea that invective or sensationalism, this is attention-grabbing stuff, and that does well.
I don't see a huge amount of problematic stuff on Facebook and Twitter, although I know it's there.
If you were to put out on Twitter, let's say, a controversial statement of some kind, something designed to court controversy, it's quite easy to become the centre of some attention. What do we go? What should we go for? So
at which point, as he continues to talk, he taps out a few letters on my computer, clicks on the mouse, and oh dear. Gosh, this is pretty, sorry to interrupt you. There's some pretty nasty stuff you're just scrolling past here. I mean, here is something that purports to be audio of a pretty well-known American public figure allegedly torturing a child. How easy would it be for the people who run Twitter to block this stuff? Because this is largely garbage, isn't it?
If content is illegal, then of course platforms need to take action on it. That is more or less difficult depending on what the type of content is. Something like copyrighted video from a football game, that is a sort of relatively easy thing to spot. But something like language is far, far more challenging. Imagine that you and I go to a room of 10 people and we show them 10 tweets that we believe may be hateful. I've done this before. Sometimes one person will think all 10 are hateful, someone else will say none are, someone else will say 4 or 5 or 8 or whatever. And if we can't decide, how on earth is a machine supposed to understand?
On my computer screen, it all looks the same.
And that's why this is so difficult.
So if it's proving difficult for the technology companies themselves to decide where to draw the line, how to police the social media sites that they've created, what about the police themselves? Well, they can get it wrong as well. Here in the UK, they came looking for Harry Miller to warn him against posting allegedly transphobic comments on Twitter, which has now banned him for life. The police said he hadn't broken the law, but he had been responsible for what they classified as hate incidents. He objected strongly. Didn't help that he himself is an ex-cop, so he took them to court, where the judge, Mr. Justice Knowles, ruled that the police had got it wrong.
I felt so strongly about it because it just contravened all my sense of open justice. One, they're ringing me and saying, you're borderline criminality because of 30 tweets. Then they won't tell me what the tweets are. Now, the net effect of that is, and I think this was what they wanted, was they wanted me just to shut up entirely.
How would you feel if governments took a much greater role in deciding on these kinds of issues?
I think the instinctive answer to that is it's a bad idea, but having seen where we are and considered where we are, I think it's a good idea. Because at the moment we have non-government agencies that are not available for scrutiny. All those social media sites are operating as international fiefdoms. They are policing, no platforming, banning for life people who express the wrong ideology. And I think the government really ought to be saying, you don't get to do that. You ban people on account of them breaking the law or being gratuitously offensive, but you don't ban them for things which normal people, the government, all of us think are perfectly reasonable discussions to be having.
Here's what worries me, though. If governments begin to get more involved in controlling what is said on social media sites, we begin to move closer to that famous George Orwell Ministry of Truth, in which governments decide what is true, what can be said, and what is not true, what can't be said.
I think Mr. Justice Knowles recognised that 100% and drew a very clear judicial line in the sand about that.
If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind.
No, those weren't the words of the judge, but rather the words of the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill, whom the judge quoted in his ruling. In theory, of course, social media sites like Twitter should be a fantastic opportunity for everyone to exercise their right to free speech. In practice, that means they're also a forum for bigotry, hate and prejudice. So, is there such a thing as too much free speech? Here's Harry Miller again.
In principle, the democratisation of any knowledge is a good thing. Now, of course, establishments always hate that. If we think back to the invention of the printing press, if we think back to the way the translators of the Bible from Latin into English were persecuted and burnt, why did that happen? That happened because knowledge went from the few to the many. And when knowledge goes from the few to the few don't like it because it gives the many the chance to challenge the few.
If anyone, including a politician, is saying things that that is calling for violence or...
That's Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook being grilled by the US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last year. She wanted to know more about who actually checks what appears on his site.
Can you explain why you've named the Daily Caller, a publication well documented with ties to white supremacists, as an official fact checker for Facebook?
Congresswoman, sure. We actually don't appoint the independent fact checkers. They go through an independent organization called the Independent Fact Checking Network that has a rigorous standard for who they allow to serve as a fact checker.
My name is Baybars Orsek. I am the director of the International Fact-Checking Network at the Poynter Institute, and I have been working with fact-checking organizations around the world to hold the public accountable, hold the people in the power accountable, and also fight against misinformation.
So let's call Baybars Orsek Mr. Facebook Fact Checker. His organization pools together fact checkers from all over the world, and to my surprise, he tells me they're not all algorithms, they're people. And the tools that they use are exactly the same as the ones I use as a journalist. They verify and they check anything that's brought to their attention as potentially problematic. But does what they do amount to restricting free speech on Facebook?
Absolutely it does not. Absolutely it does not. None of the fact-checking treatment leads to a total removal of content by platforms like Facebook the end of the day, whenever a content is flagged by fact checkers, users are still able to share that piece of content, but they just receive a warning that says that piece of particular content is flagged by a fact checker.
And as the world grapples with the devastating impact of the coronavirus pandemic, never has there been a greater need for checked facts. It can be done, as Facebook has proved, by rushing to introduce a coronavirus information network to ensure that facts take precedence before conspiracy theories and fake treatments, if you'll excuse the pun, go viral. What a shame it took a global health emergency to galvanise them into action. Facebook didn't want to talk to us for this series, but in an article last year, Mark Zuckerberg left little doubt about who he thinks should be responsible for drawing the free speech line online. Quote, "I believe we need a more active role for governments and regulators." So, where do governments stand? Well, until a few months ago, Margot James was the minister in the UK government who was responsible for digital policy. So when we met, I asked her, if governments do step in, aren't we back on that slippery slope that leads eventually to government censorship?
Well, I think there is always that risk, and I think that risk needs to be managed very carefully, because I think the majority of people would agree that that would not be a desirable outcome. Neither is a situation where there's a complete free-for-all, whereby the normal limits to free speech that operate in the offline world don't pertain online.
One example that some people have pointed to is a series of sites which have encouraged adolescent girls to be thinner, eat less, anorexia. And there's been a lot of concern that that is harmful, both to the individuals and to society at large. Would, in your view, it be justified to seek somehow to prevent those kinds of sites being published?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good example of just the sort of site that should be banned by governments if platforms are not responsible enough to remove those sites.
And yet the difference between that and a sort of dieting site or how to lose weight sort of site, quite difficult sometimes to draw the distinction.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think that over time it will become easier once regulations are in place. Also, the way we were proposing, and what I hope the government in the UK will bring into law, is get the regulator to enforce a duty of care on the platforms such that it would be in their interest to remove those sites, because if they didn't and if they let them carry on, then they would be in breach of a statutory code and the regulator could then enforce some action against them.
Okay, so bottom line, this series is called The Future of Free Speech. In your view, as a former minister, is the future of free speech online a lot less rosy than perhaps it would have seemed 3 or 4 years ago?
I think that the sort of limits that we expect to be upheld offline should be the same online. That's really kind of my starting point.
I don't think my fears are unfounded. A government's judgment about what is fake news or hate speech is unlikely to be the same as mine. Look at Singapore, for example. There, they've introduced a law called the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. Not the snappiest of titles. And as I learned from Jia Yan Chong, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore, it could easily become a step down that slippery slope I was talking about earlier.
What we call POFMA, for short, because it's a mouthful, it's a way for them to tag certain posts online that they deem to be false. It's for them to take punitive action in cases where people don't comply, so that could include takedowns. At the higher end can include things like fines and jail terms as well.
If I were to hear that a government in, let us say, North Korea or in China were implementing legislation of this kind, I wouldn't be surprised. Singapore traditionally has prided itself in not being that kind of a state.
It's quite unfortunate that the application of POFMA so far has created this sort of impression. I mean, a lot of the times it comes down to what looks like interpretation. It comes down to statements that the government claims are facts that it's very difficult to corroborate independently. That leads certainly to the impression that Singapore, is leaning towards some of these more authoritarian kinds of behavior. In particular, when you look at the military junta in Thailand and also Nigeria, they are trying to enact laws that restrict freedom of expression online, and they cite explicitly Singapore's law as inspiration.
There is a huge amount of concern right around the world at what has become known as fake news, and so I suppose it's not really surprising that governments should be looking at ways in which they can seek to get a handle on it.
Absolutely. It's just unclear to me how POFMA can effectively deal with fake news, because what we've seen, I think the most damaging kinds of fake news is when you have content farms that in large amounts push out disinformation. And these content farms, they also shift the outlets in which they release this information. If you close down one Twitter account or one Facebook account, they quickly switch to another. And they're doing this simultaneously on multiple platforms.
I mentioned China there in my conversation with Jia Yanchong. They certainly know all about restricting free speech, both online and offline, with consequences that we are all now living with. But how do they actually do it? Just before the coronavirus took hold in the UK, I went back to my old stamping ground, the BBC Newsroom in central London, to meet up with one of my former colleagues.
My name's Kerry Allen. I'm a China media analyst and my department is BBC Monitoring.
What have you got there?
So this is China's equivalent of, say, Facebook. It's known as Sina Weibo. Everybody has this. Everybody has an account on this. You can see a lot of popular posts. These are hashtags that are trending.
Are they free to say what they want to say?
On Sina Weibo? No. There are thousands of government censors, thousands of them, and what they do is they keep tabs on particularly sensitive words. There's a glossary of some of the more sensitive topics, things like, for example, the Tiananmen massacre. People all year round can't mention that. Any posts about the Tiananmen massacre will be deleted automatically.
What I find intriguing about this is, I mean, here we are in a fairly traditional sort of newsroom. I mean, it's a couple of hundred people sitting at computers. This is a different kind of newsroom, isn't it, on screen? Because in a sense, every citizen with access to a mobile phone or a computer can generate their own news.
Yeah, they can, yeah. And in China, there are more than 850 million internet users increasingly using their mobiles. In recent years, there are a number of 4G stations were set up, and China's obviously been one of the pioneers of 5G. So lots more internet access coming into the country and more people having access and being able to report themselves.
I'm trying to get my head around that number you just said. 850 million people.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how many thousand sensors you have, there's no way they can keep track of all that.
Well, there is one way that China offers an incentive for people to basically be working with the government in order for the right language to appear on social media platforms. And this is known as the 50 Cent Party. And what they are the people who are paid a very small amount of money, 50 cents, to post messages in line with the government's message. To say, for example, I mean, with the coronavirus, to promote the positive messages and to leave loads of social media messages on official media pages and say, oh, I support what the government is doing, because they get a financial incentive.
You get paid to be a sort of part-time government propagandist?
Yes.
And you flood out what the government doesn't want promulgated?
Yes, that's exactly how it works, yes. Nowadays it's become the case that a lot of platforms like Sina Weibo, like WeChat, are asking for much more personal information from people so that they can be held accountable if they write anything negative. Now, they say this is related to fake news, they say it's related to slander, for example, but it could be related to anything that just the government feels it doesn't agree with its message. But that basically means the government has people's ID numbers, it has their phone numbers, it has their address. It can very easily find people within a matter of hours.
Just as they found Dr. Li Wenliang, the man who first raised the alarm on WeChat about the new virus that he had detected in Wuhan towards the end of December last year. The authorities accused him of spreading false comments, and he had to promise not to do it again. He went back to work, became infected with the virus himself, and died in early February at the age of just 33. I didn't expect when I started work on this series that I would end up concluding that a lack of free speech could be directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people around the world and a collapse of the global economy. But according to a study conducted by scientists at Southampton University, if China had started tackling the coronavirus as soon as Li Wenliang sounded the alarm, instead of waiting 3 long weeks, it could have reduced the infection rate by 95%. Chinese internet users were quick to see the connection, and Li Wenliang's death sparked widespread outrage. Soon the hashtag freedom of speech was everywhere. Kerry Allen again.
I don't think the government anticipated the outrage from his death and the fact that he could have saved a lot of people and now he was a victim. So what happened was this hashtag went viral. So many people were really getting angry, and this was beyond the censor's control. It was very unusual, but the government first reported his death, then removed posts because they mentioned that he was a whistleblower, and then they reworded them, said he was still alive, and then they said that he was dead again.
So they were wrong-footed?
Yeah, absolutely, and this was clear for everybody to see. The heat of Li Wenliang's death didn't cool down. People were still very, very angry.
As they have every right to be, as we all have every right to be. You may have noticed that the last 2 episodes of this series have sounded a bit different from the first 3. That's because I've had to record them here at home rather than risk infection by travelling into the BBC studios. I started out with a passionate belief in the importance of free speech, but a fear that it's coming under increasing threat. So let's hear again from the political scientist Jia Yanchong of the National University of Singapore.
As we've seen with the coronavirus case in China, suppression of information, of timely information, can prevent timely reactions to crises. So I think freedom of expression is very important, but in general, I think most places have some restriction. It's not an unfettered right. So how to protect the kinds of freedom of expression that helps society move forward, that's the key question. And I don't think anybody has got that quite right at this point.
And a concluding thought from the social media analyst Alex Krasodomski here in London.
There are no good answers here. It can be tempting to call for people to be nicer online and to restrict what people can and can't say. And actually, I think it should be up to the UK and other liberal democracies to set a standard that says we are embracing freedom of speech, because when you have a gay rights activist in Uganda or a democracy activist in Syria who depends on the internet as their only space where they can get the word out about what is taking place in their spaces and find their voice, these are vital things for them. And if we can set this example, I think we'd be doing the world a great service at a time when there are states pushing in completely the opposite direction.
Free speech has always been a complex issue, but during the course of making this series, I've discovered it's now even more complex than ever before, thanks largely to the advent of the internet and the creation of a world in which virtually every one of us has access to a digital megaphone through which we can either spread useful, factual information, as the brave Dr. Li Wenliang tried to do in China, or we can spread confusion, lies and hatred, as so many others do. Who draws the line, and where do they draw it? Those are the 2 questions I began with, and I've ended up with dozens of possible answers. Of one thing, though, I am more convinced than ever. Free speech is a precious human right, but we do need to handle it responsibly to ensure that it's never taken away from us. The coronavirus pandemic is proof of what can happen when it is denied us. I'm Robin Lustig. This is the BBC World Service, and you've been listening to The Compass, the future of free speech. The producer was Tom Alban.